Before sunrise on June 2nd, 2026, an envelope appeared on the desk of Pope Leo XIV inside the Apostolic Palace. It carried no return address, no stamp, and no postmark. Security footage showed no one entering the office during the night, yet Monsignor David Wells found it there at 5:47 in the morning. Inside was a single photograph of the completed Sagrada Família, taken from a restricted gallery that had been closed during the final construction phase. One of the central columns had been circled in red ink, and beneath it someone had written a warning in Catalan: "Gaudí knew, and you buried it." In 4 days, the Pope was scheduled to fly to Barcelona and inaugurate the basilica exactly 100 years after Antoni Gaudí's death. Instead, he pressed the intercom and ordered Cardinal Pietro Parolin to come immediately. Before the ceremony could begin, Pope Leo needed to know who had entered the most secure building in Rome, what Gaudí had left behind, and why someone believed the Vatican had hidden it. Cardinal Pietro Parolin entered the papal study 12 minutes after the summons. At 71 years old, the Secretary of State moved with the controlled caution of a man who had survived decades of Vatican politics without allowing surprise to appear on his face. Then he saw the photograph lying on the Pope's desk, and his pace stopped. Parolin picked it up and studied the red circle at the base of the column. His expression remained fixed, but his breathing changed as he recognized one of the 4 central supports beneath the Tower of Jesus Christ. It was the column dedicated to Mark the Evangelist, positioned deep inside the structural heart of the completed basilica. Pope Leo asked where the image could have been taken. Parolin turned the photograph toward the morning light and identified the angle as a view from inside the Triforium Gallery, an upper section closed to the public for 2 years during the final phase of construction. Whoever had taken the image had not entered as a tourist. The possible list was suddenly narrow. Construction workers, senior architects, and perhaps a dozen members of the clergy held permanent access to those restricted levels. Parolin suggested that the envelope might be a provocation designed to disrupt the coming papal visit, but Pope Leo rejected the explanation without raising his voice. Someone had bypassed the security of the Apostolic Palace and placed the photograph directly on the papal desk without appearing on any camera. That required access, planning, and confidence that the message would reach the Pope before he left for Barcelona. Pope Leo looked again at the Catalan warning and gave Parolin his first order: assemble a team of 5 people and allow no one outside it to learn that the photograph existed. Pope Leo XIV did not ask for a large investigation. He named 5 people and instructed Cardinal Pietro Parolin to bring them together immediately: Monsignor David Wells, Archbishop Georg Genswein, Sister Natalie Beckwart, Father Jordi Bertrand, and Parolin himself. No one outside that group was to learn about the photograph until the Pope gave permission. Within the hour, the 5 investigators entered the private library of the Apostolic Palace. Their telephones were left outside, and no notebooks or recording devices were permitted inside the room. The heavy oak doors closed behind them and were locked from within, cutting the meeting off from the movement of the palace corridors. Pope Leo placed the photograph in the center of the mahogany table. He did not begin with speculation about the person who had delivered it or the reason the security cameras had recorded nothing. He turned instead to Father Bertrand and told him to explain what the image might be pointing toward before the papal visit to Barcelona. Bertrand had arrived from the Jesuit residence on Borgo Santo Spirito, still wearing his reading glasses. He was 63 years old, thin and visibly exhausted, with his black cassock open at the collar as though the summons had interrupted him before he could prepare. His nervousness did not resemble ordinary fear. It carried the weight of something he had known for years and had never expected to discuss before a pope. He began with Antoni Gaudí's final period at the Sagrada Família. During the last 12 years of his life, Gaudí abandoned every other project and devoted himself exclusively to the basilica. He moved into the workshop at the construction site, slept beside his plaster models, accepted whatever food the workers brought him, and withdrew almost completely from life beyond the building. When Gaudí died in 1926, after being struck by a tram on the Gran Via, his clothing was so worn that he was initially mistaken for a beggar. The Sagrada Familia was only about 15% complete, and much of what remained existed in models, calculations, photographs, notebooks, and the memories of the apprentices who had worked beside him. Bertrand then told the room that the familiar history of those materials was incomplete. 10 years after Gaudí's death, the Spanish Civil War reached the construction site. In 1936, anarchists attacked the crypt and workshop, set fires inside the complex, shattered plaster models, and destroyed photographs and architectural records. The accepted account held that the architects who resumed the work during the 1940s had been forced to reconstruct Gaudí's vision from fragments, surviving images, and oral testimony. Pope Leo interrupted Bertrand with a quiet statement rather than a question. That was not the whole story. Bertrand looked directly at him, understood that the Pope already suspected the answer, and admitted that it was not. 2 years before the destruction, a young Catalan priest named Father Luis Bonet had begun working closely with the construction team. He served as chaplain to the laborers and developed personal relationships with several of Gaudí's former apprentices. As political instability and anti-clerical violence intensified across Spain, Bonet became convinced that the original materials inside the basilica would not survive. Without permission from the senior architects or the bishop, Bonet began copying the documents he considered essential. He preserved structural calculations for the central nave, geometric formulas for the hyperboloid surfaces, design notes for the Tower of Jesus Christ, and proportional studies for all 18 planned towers. He could not copy everything, but he copied enough to preserve the architectural system beneath the visible building. Bonet also copied a separate group of personal notebooks kept by Gaudí during his final years. The apprentices had not stored them with the official architectural papers in the main workshop. They were kept inside a locked cabinet in the crypt sacristy, protected from ordinary access because their contents were not primarily about construction. Sister Natalie Beckwart asked what the notebooks contained. Bertrand folded his hands on the table before answering, as though the question had finally reached the point he had been trying to avoid. Gaudí had written about the Sagrada Familia not simply as a church or an architectural achievement, but as a message designed to survive him. During his final decade, Gaudí had lived with an increasingly severe religious discipline. He fasted until his health sometimes failed, prayed for extended periods, attended Mass each day, and went to confession every week. He told those around him that the Sagrada Familia was a prayer made from stone, and that every angle, measurement, and proportion carried an act of worship. The private notebooks went further than those public statements. Gaudí believed that the completed basilica would deliver a message to a future pope not through a general symbol or a devotional impression, but through an exact system built into its structure. The columns, the angles of the naves, the relationships among the towers, and the curvature of the vaulted ceilings had been arranged to form a theological argument. That argument could not be read while the building remained unfinished. Its meaning depended on every major proportion being completed and every tower reaching its intended height. The room became silent as Bertrand explained that the final stone would not merely complete the church. It would activate the message Gaudí had designed for a pope he would never live to meet. When the workshop burned in 1936, the men who later returned to the Sagrada Familia believed they were recovering a design from ruins. They sorted through broken plaster, charred photographs, damaged drawings, and fragments whose original positions could no longer be identified with certainty. What they did not know was that Father Luis Bonet had already removed the most important information from the reach of the fire. Bonet did not keep the copied material in one permanent location. As violence spread through Catalonia, the papers were moved through a discreet chain of priests who understood that discovery could lead to confiscation or destruction. Each custodian received the collection from another cleric, concealed it within parish property, and passed it onward when local conditions became dangerous. The collection remained hidden throughout the Civil War. It survived the years when religious buildings were attacked, clergy were forced into hiding, and the institutions connected to the basilica could no longer protect their own records. The copies endured because they were separated from the official construction archive before the attack began. The danger did not disappear when the fighting ended. Under the Franco regime, government power reached deeply into church administration, and sensitive material could attract attention for political as well as religious reasons. The priests responsible for the papers continued to move them between parishes rather than return them to the public record. Over time, the documents accumulated more than Gaudí's original calculations and private observations. Several custodians added notes explaining where the papers had been kept, who had transferred them, and how the chain of possession had continued. These additions created a secondary record of concealment, stretching across decades of Catalan history. Only after Spain's transition to democracy did the collection return to an institutional archive. During the early 1980s, it was deposited in the archive of the Archdiocese of Barcelona. Even there, it was not treated as an ordinary group of architectural documents available to historians. Years later, Father Bertrand encountered a catalog entry while researching his doctoral thesis on the theological symbolism of the Sagrada Familia. The description was brief: Bonet Papers, Sagrada Familia. The collection was marked as sealed, but its existence was enough to confirm that the fragments he had heard about were part of a larger surviving record. Bertrand submitted a formal request for access. The archivist examined the catalog, checked an internal register, and made a telephone call outside Bertrand's hearing. When he returned, his manner had changed, and he told Bertrand that the documents were no longer held in Barcelona. Bertrand asked where they had gone. The archivist answered that the collection had been transferred to the Holy See in 1997 through a diplomatic pouch arrangement between the Archdiocese of Barcelona and the Vatican. No public notice had accompanied the transfer, and the archival record offered no explanation for why papers concerning a church construction project required diplomatic handling. At the mahogany table, Archbishop Georg Genswein leaned forward for the first time. He confirmed that a sealed collection connected to Barcelona existed inside the Vatican archive. It had been deposited under the authority of Cardinal Angelo Sodano, who was serving as Secretary of State when the transfer occurred. Genswein had seen the index entry in 2009 while cataloging documents for Pope Benedict XVI. The collection had been classified under a title that translated approximately as Architectural Correspondence, Barcelona. The wording appeared routine, but the security restriction attached to it was not. Architectural papers did not normally receive that degree of protection. Genswein had raised the question once with Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who was then Secretary of State. Bertone told him that the classification had been established by his predecessor and would remain unchanged. Genswein had been instructed not to ask about the collection again. No explanation was given, no review was scheduled, and the index entry remained closed while construction in Barcelona continued toward completion. The papers Father Bonet had saved from fire had survived long enough to enter the most protected archival system in the church. Outside the private library, the bells of St. Peter's began ringing for the midday Angelus. Their sound reached the room through the thick palace walls, while Pope Leo rose and walked toward the window. Below him, visitors moved through St. Peter's Square without knowing that a forgotten chain of custody had just connected Gaudí's workshop to the papal office. Cardinal Parolin began to mention the protocols required to approach a sealed archival collection. The Pope did not allow the procedural objection to grow. He ordered the archive opened and instructed that every document connected to the Bonet collection be placed on the library table before the end of the day. The order moved through the Vatican archive that afternoon, under direct papal authority. The collection lay inside a temperature-controlled vault 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Library, beyond 2 biometric checkpoints and a steel door that could not be opened by one custodian alone. 2 separate keys were brought to the vault. The locks were released in sequence, and the sealed material was removed for the first time in years. The retrieval required 6 hours. 4 archival boxes were carried from the lower vault to the Apostolic Palace, each measuring approximately 40 by 30 centimeters. Every box bore red wax seals stamped with the coat of arms of the Archdiocese of Barcelona, and every document inside had been wrapped separately in acid-free tissue paper. By evening, the 5 investigators had returned to the private library. The heavy doors were locked again, archival lamps were positioned above 3 tables, and the seals were opened under the supervision of the custodians. Pope Leo stood nearby as the papers were unfolded and arranged according to date, handwriting, and subject. The scale of the surviving record exceeded anything Father Bertrand had seen referenced in Barcelona. The first group contained 47 pages of structural calculations written in Gaudí's precise and mechanical hand. Beside them were 12 pages of design modifications dated between 1918 and 1925. A separate set contained 6 pages of proportional studies showing the mathematical relationships among the 18 planned towers. 14 additional pages came from Gaudí's personal notebooks, written in a tight Catalan script so small that the investigators required magnifying glasses to read it comfortably. These were the pages Father Bonet had copied from the locked cabinet in the crypt sacristy. The notebooks connected religious meaning to exact structural decisions. Gaudí described measurements not as decorative choices, but as parts of a system that would remain incomplete until the final tower reached its intended height. Every completed section would constrain the next, preserving the argument even if later builders no longer understood why the original dimensions had been chosen. The most important object in the boxes was not one of the calculations. It was a letter written on heavy cream-colored paper and dated March 15, 1926, 3 months before Gaudí's death. The address named Pope Pius X, although that pope had already died years earlier, revealing that Gaudí was writing less to one living recipient than to the papal office he believed would eventually receive the message. The letter had never been sent. Attached to it was a note in Father Bonet's handwriting explaining that the master had instructed him to hold the document until the basilica was complete. Bonet had written that, God willing, the required day would eventually arrive. That day had now arrived. The final stone of the Tower of Jesus Christ had been placed on February 20th, 2026, bringing the structure to its full height of 172½ meters. The basilica stood complete exactly 1 century after the year of Gaudí's death. Pope Leo lifted the letter and read it without speaking. The others remained around the tables, watching for any reaction, while the archival lamps hummed above the open boxes. His face remained controlled until he reached the final pages, when his eyes slowed and the weight of what he was reading became visible. He began the letter again from the first line. This time, he kept one hand beside the proportional studies of the 18 towers and moved between the written explanation and Gaudí's calculations. When he finally placed the letter on the table, he told the group that the accepted explanation for the height of the central tower was incomplete. The public explanation was based on humility. Gaudí had said that no human construction in Barcelona should rise above Montjuic, because the work of man should not surpass the work of God. The letter did not reject that principle, but it revealed that the height had also been selected for a second and far more exact reason. The relationship between the Tower of Jesus Christ and the 12 towers of the Apostles formed a numerical sequence. That sequence depended on proportional rules Gaudí had developed across more than 20 years of work. When interpreted through the geometry of the double twist columns, it pointed toward a single year. Cardinal Parolin asked what year the calculations produced. Pope Leo did not answer immediately, because the number was already written across the completed building and had been confirmed by the final construction date. Gaudí's system pointed to 2026. Cardinal Parolin looked from the calculations to the completed date and rejected the conclusion almost immediately. Gaudí could not have known that the project would survive the Spanish Civil War, decades of financial instability, long periods of limited progress, and the technological changes that eventually made the final towers possible. Too many events beyond the architect's control stood between 1926 and 2026. Father Bertrand answered by returning to the earliest structural drawings. Gaudí had not attempted to predict every war, financial crisis, or political decision that would affect the basilica. He had designed the completed portions so precisely that later architects would inherit a sequence of engineering constraints they could not easily escape. The dimensions of the foundations established the spacing of the central columns. That spacing fixed the height and curvature of the vaults, while the vaults determined the dimensions of the tower bases above them. Once those relationships had been placed into stone, each new phase had to obey the geometry of the phase before it. The building could not be completed by simply adding material faster. Every section required calculations, techniques, and load-bearing solutions that depended on the unfinished structure beneath it. Gaudí had created a geometric bottleneck that controlled not only the appearance of the basilica, but also the pace at which it could safely rise. Archbishop Ganswein studied the sequence and described what the calculations implied. Gaudí had built a timeline into the stone. The wars, shortages, and political interruptions had influenced the visible history of construction, but beneath them remained an architectural system steadily directing the project toward a century of work. Sister Nathalie Becourt asked whether Gaudí had merely estimated that the construction would take 100 years. Father Bertrand shook his head and pointed to the linked measurements across the structural notes. The architect had not simply expected a century, he had created conditions that made a much faster completion structurally improbable. Pope Leo returned to the unsent letter. Gaudí wrote that the completion date mattered because the basilica had been designed to speak only when every essential relationship among its parts was present. Until the Tower of Jesus Christ reached its full height, the message remained mathematically unfinished. The double twist columns formed the next part of that message. Each column spiraled in two directions at once, expressing saints rising toward God and angels descending toward humanity. Scholars had long recognized that symbolism, but the notebooks revealed that the precise angles of the spirals changed deliberately from one column to another. Near the Nativity facade, the twists were broad and open, Gaudí associated those columns with the early church, when missionary energy carried the faith outward and the distance between the church and the world had not yet narrowed into defensiveness. As the columns advanced toward the central altar, their spirals became tighter and more compressed. Gaudí described that gradual compression as a movement through church history. The narrowing represented an institution becoming more guarded as spiritual crisis intensified in the modern world. The two spirals continued to rise and descend, but the space between them diminished with every stage. The final central column stood directly beneath the Tower of Jesus Christ. Its opposing spirals approached each other more closely than those of any other column in the basilica. In the notebooks, Gaudí gave it a name, the Column of Decision. According to his explanation, the completed church would reach a point of maximum compression at the moment the final tower was finished. It would then face two possible paths, one leading backward into defensive retreat and the other opening toward renewal. The structure did not determine which path the church would choose. It marked the hour when the choice could no longer be avoided. Pope Leo lifted the letter and read the passage Gaudí had intended for the future papal office. The basilica was not a monument but a clock, and the placement of its last stone meant that the appointed hour had arrived. Gaudí urged the future pope not to allow the spirals to close, but to open them again while the stones were still speaking. The night of June 2nd passed without anyone leaving the private library. Pope Leo ordered a complete forensic examination of the Bonnet collection, and Father Bertrand worked beside two senior Vatican archivists who specialized in manuscripts from the 19th and 20th centuries. Every page was separated, photographed, and compared with authenticated material from Barcelona. The handwriting matched known examples of Antoni Gaudí's script. The paper and ink were consistent with materials used in Catalonia during the 1920s, while the wax seals matched the collection's transfer records from the late 1990s. By the morning of June 3rd, the archival team had reached a firm conclusion. The documents were genuine. Monsignor David Wells then contacted a discreet group of structural engineers and architects at the Polytechnic University of Turin. Without revealing where the formulas had come from, he asked them to test whether the tower proportions truly encoded the year 2026 and whether Gaudí's foundations created a natural construction period of approximately 1 century. The preliminary findings arrived by midday. The ratios among the 18 towers did converge on 2026, and the changing twist angles of the columns followed the historical progression described in the notebooks. The foundation depths, column spacing, and load-bearing requirements also created a geometric bottleneck that limited how quickly the basilica could be completed. The evidence changed Pope Leo's visit to Barcelona. What had begun as an inauguration was now becoming a public reckoning with a message Gaudí had placed inside the building itself. The remaining question was no longer whether the documents were authentic, but whether the Vatican would reveal them. By the evening of June 3rd, Pope Leo had made his decision. He would reveal the Bonnet documents during the inauguration ceremony at the Sagrada Família on June 6th, and he would present the evidence himself. Inside the Vatican, the reaction was immediate. Cardinal Marc Ouellet urged delay. In a 45-minute call with Cardinal Pietro Parolin, he warned that the mathematical claims would attract conspiracy theories, secular ridicule, architectural disputes, and confusion among the faithful. He argued for a 6-month commission, a formal review by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and a controlled academic publication. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle took the opposite position. He told Sister Natalie Beckwith that if the documents were authentic, the Church had no right to hide them for 6 months or even 6 weeks. Gaudí had prepared the message for the moment of completion, and that moment had already arrived. The debate continued through the night inside the Apostolic Palace. Monsignor David Wells drafted 3 versions of a public statement with different levels of disclosure. Father Jordi Bertrand prepared a 20-page summary for journalists, while Archbishop Jord Genswein reviewed the legal and canonical consequences of releasing documents from a sealed archival collection. Pope Leo listened to every objection but did not reverse his decision. The evidence had been authenticated, the engineering claims had survived independent examination, and the basilica was already complete. Delaying the announcement would not create greater certainty. It would only separate the message from the moment Gaudí had designed for it. On the morning of June 4th, the secrecy surrounding the Bonnet collection collapsed. La Vanguardia published a report by veteran investigative journalist Marta Soler revealing that a sealed group of Gaudí papers had been transferred from Barcelona to the Vatican nearly 30 years earlier. The article did not know what the documents contained, but it asked the question the Vatican could no longer contain. What had been hidden about Antoni Gaudí? Within 2 hours, the story had spread through the major international news agencies and across European television networks. Reporters from 30 countries began calling the Holy See press office, camera crews gathered in St. Peter's Square, and satellite trucks filled the Via della Conciliazione. The internal debate had become a global crisis before the Vatican had released a single page. Pope Leo read the coverage in his study beside Cardinal Pietro Parolin. Parolin immediately recognized that someone with knowledge of the Barcelona transfer had leaked the collection's existence. The Pope ordered him to investigate the breach later, because the immediate priority was preparing the disclosure. Matteo Bruni, director of the Holy See press office, was summoned within minutes. Pope Leo instructed him to schedule a press conference at the Sagrada Família on June 6th. Immediately after the inauguration ceremony. When Bruni noted that only 2 days remained, the Pope repeated the order without changing his tone. The interim statement confirmed that the Vatican possessed historical documents connected to Antoni Gaudí and the Sagrada Família. It promised that the Pope would address their contents during his visit to Spain and offered no further explanation. The controlled confirmation stopped the most reckless speculation, but it guaranteed that the world would be watching Barcelona. During the next 48 hours, Pope Leo withdrew from the public movement of the Apostolic Palace. He read Gaudí's notebooks 3 times with a Catalan dictionary beside him and checked the structural calculations with a pencil in hand. His earlier engineering studies allowed him to follow the formulas without relying entirely on advisors. In the early morning, he walked alone through the Vatican gardens while the final preparations continued around him. Those who saw him said he appeared neither anxious nor excited, but settled into a quiet certainty. The documents had not created the decision. They had given precise form to something he already believed the Church needed to confront. Father Jordi Bertrand spent the same period inside the Vatican Library. He compared Gaudí's system with published construction studies, the work of architect Jordi Bonnet, and technical research from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. Every comparison supported the same conclusion, and the embedded timeline matched the actual century of construction with an error margin of less than 18 months. On the evening of June 4th, Pope Leo called one final meeting in his private chapel. Only Cardinal Pietro Parolin and Father Bertrand joined him in the small room, where 3 wooden chairs faced a single crucifix. The Pope carried one handwritten page, containing the statement he intended to deliver in Barcelona. The full statement ran for 12 paragraphs. It acknowledged the Bonnet collection, described the unsent letter, explained the proportional system of the 18 towers, and presented the independent structural findings from Turin. It also rejected the idea that Gaudí had performed a miracle or predicted the future through supernatural knowledge. Pope Leo described the basilica as the result of genius, patience, calculation, and faith in those who would continue the work. Gaudí had trusted that later hands would carry forward what his own hands could not finish through war, poverty, delay, and doubt. The completed building proved that this trust had not been misplaced. The final passage returned to the clock and the spirals. The Church, the Pope wrote, could not become a monument to its own past because it remained a living structure that had to continue rising and renewing itself. The hour Gaudí had built into stone had arrived, and the message now demanded an answer. Parolin remained silent after the reading and warned that the reaction would reach every newspaper, theologian, and conspiracy forum. Pope Leo answered that every detail would still be disclosed, including the column of decision. Father Bertrand tried to respond, but emotion stopped him, and he gave the Pope only a silent nod. The photograph that had appeared on Pope Leo's desk was never traced to its source. The Vatican Security Review found no breach in the surveillance system, no fingerprints on the envelope, no biological trace on the paper, and no record of anyone entering the papal office during the night. The Vatican Gendarmerie concluded only that the delivery could have been carried out by an authorized person whose identity remained unknown. Inside the Vatican, some believed the photograph had been placed deliberately by someone who knew the Bonnet collection existed. That person may also have understood that the inauguration was more than a ceremony and that June 6th represented the deadline Gaudí had built into the basilica. Whoever sent the image had ensured that the Pope would not enter the completed Sagrada Família without first knowing what the central column meant. On the morning of June 6, 2026, Pope Leo departed for Spain. His chartered aircraft left Rome Fiumicino Airport at 7:15 in the morning, carrying the original Bonnet documents inside archival cases secured within a leather briefcase. Father Jordi Bertrand sat beside him with photocopies of Gaudí's notebooks in his hands. He had not slept for 3 days, and his fingers still trembled slightly as the aircraft climbed away from Rome. Ahead of them waited the completed basilica, the inauguration ceremony, and a press conference the entire world was now expecting. The identity of the person who delivered the photograph might never be known. The meaning of the message, however, was about to be placed before the world. As the aircraft moved toward Barcelona, the original Bonnet documents remained sealed inside archival cases within the Pope's leather briefcase. Beside him, Father Jordi Bertrand held the photocopies of Gaudí's notebooks with hands that still trembled from 3 sleepless nights. Below them, the completed Sagrada Família stood at the exact height its architect had fixed 1 century earlier. The basilica was no longer an unfinished vision. All 18 towers now formed the complete proportional system described in the recovered papers, and the Tower of Jesus Christ had reached 172½ meters. For the first time, the building contained every relationship Gaudí said was necessary for its message to become readable. The ceremony ahead would place that message before the world. Pope Leo would reveal the unsent letter, the encoded year, the changing geometry of the columns, and the final structure Gaudí had called the column of decision. He would insist that the achievement did not require prophecy, but extraordinary calculation, patience, and faith in generations the architect would never live to see. The revelation would also force the Church to confront the warning built into the tightening spirals. According to Gaudí's notebooks, the completed basilica marked a moment when retreat and renewal could no longer remain abstract ideas. The last stone had transformed the architecture from a construction project into a demand for a decision. Yet one question would remain outside every document carried on the aircraft. No investigation had identified the person who placed the photograph on the papal desk, and no camera had shown how the envelope entered the apostolic palace. Whoever delivered it had understood that June 6th was not merely the date of an inauguration, but the deadline hidden inside the building. That unknown messenger had disappeared from the story before the Pope left Rome. The photograph had already completed its purpose by forcing the Bonnet collection into the light before Leo crossed the threshold of the finished basilica. The identity behind the warning could remain unanswered because the meaning of the warning no longer could. 100 years after Antoni Gaudí's death, the church he had designed was complete, the Pope was on his way, and the stones were finally ready to speak.